Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'm Seth Miller, Executive Director of the nonprofit Oregon Parks Forever. We're a 25-year-old nonprofit that raises funds to preserve and enhance the experience of using Oregon's parks. We're pleased to have you join us this evening for our panel discussion about the impacts of the Labor Day wildfires on Oregon's public lands. This will be the first of a series of monthly webinars we'll hold on topics of interest to our members. And we were absolutely blown away to have more than 1,800 folks pre-register for this tonight. We're thankful to our panelists who made themselves available tonight to help us all understand the impact of having more than twice the number of acres of forest burned than the state normally experiences in a full year. Megan Josie from our team is providing tech support for this panel. So if you have technical questions related to using Zoom, you can use the chat feature, which you should see in the control bar at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions at any time during the presentation, you can use the Q&A feature, and Megan will gather them together and select some that we'll be able to deal with at the end of the presentation. We're only going to have a few minutes for questions, so we're not going to be able to get to every one of them. This webinar is being recorded, and we expect to make the recording available on our website, orparksforever.org, as soon as it's available, and we'll send all participants an email message when it is available. If you are interested in learning how you can help restore our forests, please stay on to the end of the webinar for some ideas. Now I got to figure out why we share the screen. So our panelists tonight represent 3 of the agencies that manage the most acreage in Oregon. To give you some perspective, here's a map that shows who manages which public lands in Oregon. You can see in green that the U.S. Forest Service is a very large manager of lands, especially along the Cascade Range. The Bureau of Land Management in orange is also a very large manager of lands, as you can see heavily in the southeastern corner as well as along the Willamette Valley. And the Oregon Department of Forestry in purple, and the Oregon Parks and Recreation are the blue dots of the 255 state parks. So now I'd like to introduce our panelists for the night. Jim Gershbach is a public affairs specialist with the Oregon Department of Forestry. Jim's going to lead us off. He's going to give an overview of the Labor Day fires and how they compare to past fires. When Jim is done, our other panelists will discuss the impacts of the fires on the lands managed by their agencies. Lynn Burdett is a forest supervisor and area manager of the Forest Service. Aaron Curtis is the section chief for social sciences for the U.S. Bureau of Land Management for Oregon and Washington. And Robbie Lefebvre is a reforestation coordinator with the Oregon Department of Forestry. So Jim, why don't we let you get started?
Thanks, Seth. Welcome, everyone. In the next few minutes, I'll try and put Oregon's Labor Day wildfires into a historical context and give you some sense for their unprecedented scope and scale, which led to them being declared a national disaster September 15th by President Trump. We're also going to try and shed light on whether Oregonians could have expected big wildfires as the kind we saw on Labor Day. So to start, let's look at the fire trends. Seth, if you can advance the slide. Okay, we're now looking at a bar chart that shows the past 3 decades in Oregon wildfire history. So each of these bars represents total acreage burned in each of the years of that decade, starting with the 1990s on the left, the early decade of this century in the middle, and then our last decade on the right. What you'll notice here is that since the 1990s, wildfire sizes have been increasing. They essentially doubled from the 90s to the first decade of the 20th century. And since the 90s, they've more than tripled by this decade. So we're, as was mentioned earlier on, we're over 500,000 acres now burned, whereas in the 90s, only about 150, not quite 150,000 acres on average were burning. Now, it's not because the number of fires in Oregon has been increasing. It hasn't. Actually, there were fewer fires in the past decade than there were in the 1990s on average. But the size of each of those fires has been getting larger. We've been having more very large fires, and in particular, lots more mega fires. So a mega fire is defined roughly as any fire over 100,000 acres. And we saw in the entire 20th century approximately 7 mega fires from 1902, the Eckholt burn, up into the 1990s. Now, just in the period from the beginning of this century until August of this year, there were another 16. So we can see that just in the last 20 years, they had doubled the number of megafires. And then now, since we have had 5 megafires in the last 72 hours after Labor Day, we pushed that number to 21, which means we've tripled just in the first 2 decades of our century over the numbers that were experienced over the last 100 years. Now, this trend of increasing fire size is also reflected nationally, where fires have gone from 3.3 million acres burned 2 decades ago. That's literally doubled to 6.6 million acres burned nationally in the past 10 years. So if you want to know, that's roughly the size of Massachusetts, the state of Massachusetts burning every year. So if we can advance to the next slide. So what you see here is the National Interagency Fire Center's Predictive Services. They put out a 3-month forecast. This is what they were predicting back in June would be the case for August. The red color represents above normal potential for fire activity. And you can see that the fire forecasters were expecting that there would be high significant fire danger throughout almost all of Oregon and much of Washington. That actually was an August prediction, and it continued to worsen, as we'll see in the next slide about drought. And that drought slide, red representing severe extreme drought and orange representing severe drought, tan moderate drought, and yellow abnormally dry conditions. The entire western part of the state was abnormally dry on August 18th. And over the next 3 weeks, those drought conditions actually worsened right up through to the time of Labor Day. So you have very dry drought conditions at the end of a long summer of drought. And then just prior to Labor Day, there was a heat wave that much of the state experienced. So for example, the Medford area experienced temperatures starting September 1st that were above 93 degrees for every single day up until Labor Day, when their temperatures actually hit 98 degrees. It's 97 in Roseburg on Labor Day, 91 in Springfield, 89 in Salem. So hot and dry. And then what comes next, in the next slide, a forecast for once in a generation wind event, dry east winds that were to prove really the catalyst for driving these fires that we saw. So red flag warnings, which means there's going to be a lot of fire risk from wind-driven fires, were issued at 2:39 that afternoon. And by that evening, either existing fires that were already on the landscape or new fires that began were being whipped by these winds. Now, the gusts at some of the tops of the mountain passes reach 70 to 80 miles an hour. It's enough to snap off a 12-inch tree 30 feet from the ground. And further down the canyons that these east winds were barreling down, speeds reach 30 to 40 miles per hour. And that means that embers, as you can see here from the Holiday Farm Fire, embers were shooting out a mile to up to 3 miles ahead of the flame fronts. That the Holiday Farm Fire that was pictured here spread just over 9 hours time. It spread 16 miles down the Mackenzie River Canyon. That's an advance of almost a mile every 30 minutes. That makes it impossible for firefighters to really control a fire like that. And they in fact spent the first couple of days literally just helping law enforcement get people out of the way of those fires. Life safety was the main order of business because it was impossible to stop the forward motion of those fires. In some cases, firefighters reported that they had to literally throw people onto their fire trucks because they couldn't get out of their driveways because of the trees down by the wind. So it's really a miracle when you consider the dense population of these wind-driven fires into populated areas that we only know of 9 civilian casualties. And if you look at the next slide here, you can see that by about October 19th, when this perimeter was shown, the 16 major fires that were being battled that either started or grew tremendously during the Labor Day fires. This is the area and the location, and you can see it was literally from the coast through the Cascades all the way down to the border with California. Now, since October 19th, we've had a little bit of an update on the numbers here. The acres burned is still, just from the Labor Day fires, is a little over 1 million acres. But structures, we now have estimates that about 4,000 residences burned and about 1,000 other buildings. And if you go to the next slide, we can see that Talent and Phoenix, which is actually one of the smaller fires in terms of area burned, was one of the most significant fires in terms of homes lost. About 2,350 or so were just lost in that fire as it burned through Talent and Phoenix. Now, about 10 other Oregon communities also lost homes or other structures, some being entirely wiped out. Communities from Gates, Idana, Detroit, Lyons, Mill City, Vida, Blue River, Leesburg, even Lincoln City over on the coast lost homes, and Chiloquin. Next slide. So if you look at the 15 largest wildfires since 1900, so that's a 120-year span, you can see that just this September, we actually pushed 3 new fires into that top tier of largest wildfires experienced since 1900. The Lions Head Fire, the Beachy Creek Fire, and the Holiday Farm Fire, all outlined in red there on your screen, now represent the 3 of the top 15 fires. And most of these fires that you see in this top 15, other than the 2 Tillamook burn fires, all of these have occurred in the last 20 years or so. So let's look real quickly then at the Labor Day fires that did burn in Oregon. Where did they burn? Well, it was just about equally between, private forest lands of all kinds, about 37% roughly. About 60,000 of those acres were on small private wood landowners, the rest on large industrial. The federal government, both the U.S. Forest Service and the BLM and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, were about 3/5 of it, about 60% or more, was burning on federal lands, and about 40% on private and state and local lands. And most of the lands that were burning west of the Cascades that were on private and state lands and BLM lands were protected by the Oregon Department of Forestry. And if you look at the costs for suppression of these fires, while these are certainly preliminary estimates, and just speaking about large fires, not about initial attack, small fires, but just the large fires over 100 acres, roughly $354 million just to put those fires out. And that's for the entire year of 2020. And then you can see that while we had $99 million suppressing all the fires for the year up to September 7th, the Labor Day fires alone were 2.5 times the amount spent just to control those fires. And keep in mind, this does not include property damage, loss of business, or the cost of rebuilding or reforestation. So by every measure, the Labor Day fires were unparalleled and unprecedented in Oregon's firefighting experience, at least in modern times.
Thank you, Jim. As Jim pointed out, the U.S. Forest Service was the beneficiary, if you will, or the victim of the largest number of acres burned. And so I've asked Lynn Burdett to come and join us and talk about the effect on the U.S. Forest Service properties.
Thank you very much, Seth. And I appreciate the opportunity to visit with all of you who are here this evening. As mentioned, my name is Lynn Burdett, and I work for the Forest Service. I'm assisting with our what we call OCAR, which is our Operation Care and Recovery effort. And my role is helping facilitate our interagency coordination efforts that we're doing in response to the fire recoveries. I want to start out by acknowledging everyone who was affected by these fires. These fires, as you could see in the pictures that Jim just shared, they affected people, communities. They've changed things for many people's lifetimes. They also affected the environment, and they have affected the experience that many of us will have with the landscape in the future. In addition, as many of you are aware, the smoke from the fires went well beyond even the state of Oregon and had an effect throughout the southern part of Washington. So we want to just start out by acknowledging that. This is one of those events that's both a physical event, but also an emotional event. I'm going to touch on a few things tonight, just so that you hear some different elements from each of us. Partly what I'll discuss with you all is what we call the burned area emergency response process that we use for immediate reactions. I'm going to talk, Seth, I'm going to have you go back one slide just for a moment. I'm going to talk also about the interagency coordination that we're doing and some things that we're considering moving forward. And so in this, we generally have 3 phases that most of the agencies go through. When we're in the response to the fire, we have what's called suppression repair. And that's work that is done to address situations where perhaps we put in a fire line. How can we go in and mitigate the possibility of erosion from that fire line? So we're repairing the work that we did in the suppression effort. Then we look at burned area emergency response, which I'll talk more about, and that's usually around immediate stabilization. And then longer term recovery and restoration. The other piece I wanted to mention on here, and we're not going to invest a lot of time in this tonight, but the notion of our interagency coordination. This is a major event for the state of Oregon. It is a FEMA declaration, and the state recovery functions have moved into place. And so there are a number of those recovery functions underway and task forces where we're all trying to work together so that you get an integrated response to things. Go ahead now, Seth, to the next slide. One of the things that as we go through this, I do want to mention, I'm going to give sort of big picture view, but as Jim shared some estimates of acreage impacting different landowners or land managers, one of the things to also recognize is, although say the National Forest System might have a certain number of your public lands that we're responsible for that were affected, each fire was slightly different. So there were a few fires that were almost 100% on National Forest. And then there were other fires that were quite a mix. For example, the Thielsen fire on Umpqua was about 100% National Forest, while the Riverside fire in the Clackamas area was on National Forest, Bureau of Land Management, private lands, state lands, and local lands. And so I just want to acknowledge that, again, there's different situations. All the agencies are doing our best to take an all-hands approach to recovery, similar to what we try to do in fire response. And as you move forward, I encourage you to look at the wildfire recovery landing page that the state of Oregon is structuring. And that's going to look at all kinds of elements, the economic recovery, the various things associated with natural resource and other elements. So I'm going to invest a few minutes to talk with you today about what burned area emergency response is. And I'm going to give you the A version of an A to Z process. So imagine that this is just the very simple overview. Burned area emergency response is that second phase that I talked about. So in fire suppression repair, we're doing immediate post-fire actions to repair damage, minimize soil erosion potential, and mitigate the effects of our fire suppression work. The burned area emergency response is a rapid assessment that's done of watersheds We bring in a team of folks with a whole variety of expertise, and they identify imminent post-fire threats to either human life and safety, the property, or the critical natural or cultural resources. For burned area emergency response, that's on national forest system lands. And they identify actions we ought to take for immediate stabilization before we have the first post-fire damaging events if possible. So we're going into the rainy season. How can we mitigate situations so that as we hit winter weather, we've mitigated some of those? And so I'm going to talk about this on the National Forest System lands, but I want to mention this is an example where we're working together. And the Department of Interior with the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Bureau of Land Management uses a similar emergency stabilization response effort. And then later I'll talk very briefly about something called ETARTS, which we're doing for private and state lands and trying to integrate all of these together. So our goal with the burn area emergency response is that, as you can see here, the emergency that's resulting may not be over simply because you can't see the flames. And post-fire hazards, a lot of times people don't think about those. And so how can we help people be aware of them? This is a process. You come in and do a rapid evaluation, and we look at critical values, which may vary according to the landowner. The team that comes in looks at and prescribes emergency stabilization treatments that can deal with unacceptable risk. And they look at threats to all forest values that may be occurring. So there may be the possibility of a landslide up on a hillside that could affect a bridge or a state highway, for example. And so these are some of the things that they look at. They also try to look at the long-term restoration needs that might exist. So they begin that process of thinking about it. And those long-term recovery things are non-emergency actions that may help improve the fire impacted lands that won't recover naturally. Along with that, and I'm not going to invest much time in this today, we're also doing some rapid assessment teams that are separate from the burned area emergency response to look at what some of those needs and opportunities might be. Next slide, Seth.
Not advancing.
And we can skip over that one because I just hit on all the points. So let's go to the next one. And again, as I mentioned, there's a similar process being used by the Department of Interior, and then also the ETART group, which is the Erosion Threat Assessment and Reduction Team, is being coordinated by FEMA and the Oregon Department of Forestry. And so when we get all these results, part of the goal is to create a synthesized assessment that we can all use. Now I'm going to go back more to the Forest Service process, and really what we do as the fundamental piece of this that I'm going to talk about tonight is we look at fire intensity and burn severity. Next slide. And there are two maps that I've included in here. I do want to mention, for those of you who are interested in a lot of this information, this is posted on the NCWeb sites, and I can put that in the chat when I'm done talking. I'll give you the link to where you can go, and you can see the summaries for each of the major fires from these burned area emergency responses, and they'll walk you through some things. I included an example of a soil burn severity map just to give you a look at things. The red color, and regrets if we have people have color challenges with this, but the red color is high soil burn severity, yellow is moderate, the bluer is low, and the green is very low. And one of the pieces with soil burn severity is it often is a great way to assess where are some of the impacts really likely to occur. where are we likely to not to have runoff occur, to have the soil not respond as well. I'm going to have you go ahead to the next slide. And this is a vegetation mortality map. I actually used them for 2 different fires just so you could see different things. But often a vegetation mortality map might show more mortality than when you look at soil burn severity. And that's because there may be quite a bit more of the above ground vegetation that was affected and that's visible to us that gives you a sense of what things might look like. And yet you can do an assessment of how the soil is going to respond by looking at that soil burn severity. And again, with this, we're looking at the loss of basal area. This particular one is from the Holiday Farm fire, and you can see the reds are the 91 to 100%. So there was quite a bit of area where some fairly high vegetation mortality as the fire moved through. And Jim gave some description of how quickly that fire moved. The assessments that were done by our teams that looked at these covered over 1 million acres of footprint, similar to what Jim described. In order to do these, we use a whole variety of tools, including LIDAR and satellite data and other things. The products from these works are shared with partners. In fact, the burned area emergency response assessments have been shared with over 155 partners. And so many people are using this to help inform what are the situations out there. So again, the BAER teams are focused on the immediate emergency needs. And then what I want to share with you is relative to that is to mention that more than $3 million in emergency funding has already been authorized for national forest lands. This is where different agencies have different processes. However, that money is being used for safety signing, closing facilities, dealing with drainage structures, trying to do storm proofing, hazard tree removal, invasive species removal, and native species planting. We try to do a lot of that before we go into the winter. However, given the late timing of the fires, it's likely much of that will happen next spring. A huge focus, and this is throughout, the Oregon Department of Transportation has been a major partner in all of these efforts with all the landowners, trying to help think about how can we remove the hazard trees, particularly along highways. And I'll share a few pictures about that in just a minute. I wanted to go back and say that our estimate, and I did not do this by fire because with only 10 minutes to share, there's not a lot of time to go through, but what we currently estimate on National Forest System lands is that more than 1,300 miles of forest road, 850 miles of trails, 50 road bridges, 47 trail bridges, 163 administrative facilities, and 88 recreation facilities are anticipated to have been impacted by either the fires or wind damage. And wind damage also occurred on the Siuslaw National Forest during the events that happened that time period. And so the costs associated with those is fairly large. We don't have an estimate to share right now, but it's, as you can imagine, that's a large amount of costs. This also does not include any calculations for culverts or structures other than bridges that may have been impacted. So I wanted to share that with you just to give you a sense of what that looks like across the way. And now I'm going to show you just a few pictures to encourage you to think about as you're experiencing these forest events out there. Those of you who might be imagining going out, the two top pictures on here are to give you an example of how in many situations, these fires burn in a way where when the fire isn't visible anymore, oftentimes people imagine that things are okay. The tree on the left, after that fire goes out, sort of looks like it's stable and all right. However, there's not anything interior to that. So that that tree can easily come down. On the right side is actually a picture during the holiday farm fire where people were trying to encourage folks, don't come back and look at your house right now, because this is what things looked like. And you can see the fire burning in the root structure underground. The other two pictures are simply to give you a sense of what roads might look like. Again, I didn't go over the entire BAER process, but one thing we look at is the geologic stability and what's likely to occur. And so you can see that there are going to be hazards all along roads and trails. Next slide, Seth. These are just a couple of examples of some impacts that occurred on a few recreation sites. The left one is a trailhead that was affected in the Beachy Creek fire on the Mount Hood National Forest, and the right one is the vault toilet. For any of you who've been to the Delta campground and the Delta Old Growth Grove down in the Blue River area, that vault toilet was destroyed. And so many structures like this have been affected. And then one last slide, Seth. So one of the things that we encourage you to think about as we look at those kinds of numbers that I shared with you, there's obviously a lot of work to be done. Many people want to get out into the forest and help. And I work in an area that was impacted by fire a few years ago, and people love these forests, whether they're residents of the area or they have a strong visceral connection because they care about the place, so they want to come help. And one of the things that we want to encourage you all to do is pay attention to closures where they exist. They are there for reasons. You're likely to see some signs trying to let people know what some of the risks are. These are just a few example signs for you, and then some examples where we may see rocks and other things move off of hillsides. And those come unexpectedly. So encourage you to check websites before you think about visiting, honor these areas, and recognize that trails and bridges are out, the culverts may not be functional, we could have falling hazards. And should you feel a strong need to go visit an area and then need help, you also put our first responders at risk. And so I'm going to end on that so that I can leave some time for Aaron and Robbie and then be available for questions.
Super, thank you, Lynn. Now what I'd like to do is turn it over to Aaron Curtis in the Bureau of Land Management.
Hi, thank you, Seth, and thank you everyone for participating in this evening's webinar. I'm Aaron Curtis with the Bureau of Land Management at our Oregon-Washington State Office in Portland. And as Jim mentioned previously, the Labor Day fires affected about 125,000 acres of Bureau of Land Management lands in Western Oregon. And those were primarily from the Riverside, Beachy Creek, and Archie Creek fires that affected the Bureau of Land Management, Northwest Oregon and Roseburg districts. Like Lynn so eloquently stated, I think all of us are collaborating across agencies and trying to work together as much as possible. The Bureau of Land Management is certainly a part of those conversations. And I think what I really kind of wanted to do is bring it down to even more of a micro level of some of the things that have been discussed previously and some of the, the work we had ahead of us. I know many of you have questions about, what the plans are for restoration of these lands that were affected by the fires. And in many ways, we're still figuring out those answers ourselves. And in many ways, I think, the photo, my background photo, this is the Fisherman's Bend recreation site along the Santiam River near Mill City, Oregon. It was, completely destroyed by the fire. And so along those lines, before we can even get in and start beginning to make plans, like Lynn mentioned, we've got a lot of hazardous trees or unseen risks out there before it's even safe for our staff to get in and assess the damage and determine what the next steps are going to be. After that, and I think it's also important to note, right, there's public roads and utilities at risk from the hazardous trees as well. So we've got a lot of priorities that are out there in addressing just some of these fundamental issues facing us right now. After we get hazardous trees addressed in a place like a recreation area such as this, we're going to have to get in there and assess and remedy any issues associated with hazardous materials that may be present as a result of the fire damage. So again, that would be another key first step before we can, again, have our interdisciplinary specialists get out and make assessments and in plans for both short and long term of where we're going from here with some of these special places on our public lands. So at that point in time, I think that's where, just to, again, to provide you with some of the scale that the challenges that the BLM has ahead of us, we've got over 25 developed recreation sites and areas that are in that situation that I just described right there, with, you know, that had some level of degree of damage to them. And so when I think, you know, just to put that back into the perspective of the entire 125,000 acres of Bureau of Land Management lands that were affected, you know, there's a whole host of complex challenges and that we're going to have to be facing. So the, and I think again, that will bring me to my final point of that really is more of a, I think, a request to the participants on this evening's webinar is to share that story about the legitimate public safety concerns that are out there still on some of these public lands that have been affected by the fires, and to not only to have you respect some of those, but help us get the word out about the importance of them to your friends and family who may also be curious about what's happened out there. And that's the end of report, Seth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aaron. And now I'd like to give the floor to Robbie Lefebvre from the Oregon Department of Forestry. Robbie is responsible for, he's a reforestation coordinator. And I thought that would be interesting to talk about, you know, where do we go next? So Robbie?
Perfect, thanks Seth. Hey everybody, my name is Robbie Lefebvre. I'm the reforestation coordinator for the State Forest Division here out of Salem, but we work on all the districts. And I do want to talk about the impacts to the San Diego State Forest. My last slide, I'll go into some of the reforestation, but I do want to talk also about the impacts to our recreation program, as I figured a lot of the people on this call would be interested in that. I'll also talk a little bit just about our forest and then kind of the burn severity that we saw on our forest. What you're looking at here is just Shellberg Falls and Natural Arch. They're two of our probably most popular attractions on the San Diego State Forest, and you can both see that they were heavily impacted. And I'll talk more about them in the next few slides. So next slide, Seth. I want to start with the forest closure, and you've heard it before. You know, currently the entire San Diego State Forest is closed to the public, and we get asked a lot why the fire's out. And we're really doing it for multiple reasons. One, there is a safety concern, but we also really need to protect the resource that's out there and that's been damaged. So for example, we have 190 miles of road inside the fire perimeter, but we know that we have about 125 culverts that have burned out on those 190 miles. So if the public is out there recreating and drives over one of them and they collapse, not only is there significant risk to injuring yourself and your family, but you're then going to further damage the resource that we have out there. So the example in this case would be you're going to increase sedimentation into streams which have endangered winter steelhead in them. And so we're really just asking for your help right now to stay out of the forest. And You know, the Santiam State Forest to me is a very special place. My wife and dog and cat recreate out there all the time. Yes, we take our cat in a backpack, so that's out there now. But we use it, we love it. And as soon as we can get out there, we'll let you know. It'll be on Twitter, it'll be on Facebook, it'll be on the media, it'll be in the newspapers. But right now, we just need your help. Next slide, Seth. So a little bit about the Santiam State Forest. We'll dive in a little bit even further from, you know, what Aaron and Lynn have done. So the Santiam State Forest is 47,000 acres. We've got 2 main blocks and then some scattered ownership. And it's east of the town of Detroit and north is kind of where the ownership is. So it was heavily impacted by the Beachy Creek fire and a little bit by the Lion's Head fire. And so when the fires kicked off, we thought, and we were watching MODIS and Landsat imagery those first few days, we thought we were going to lose the whole thing. And we had some foresters up there who had spent their whole careers and they felt like they were watching their life's work burn. And so it was a really kind of challenging few days. And, you know, we had firefighters that were up there fighting the fire as their house was burning. And they were evacuating people as they watched their office building burn down. And so those first few days, it was just kind of really tough on everyone. And then we started getting some reports and the fire kind of slowed down. And we saw that about 24,000 acres were in the fire perimeter. And so we felt a little bit better. That's about 51% of the forest, but it was still kind of just gut wrenching. Come to today where, you know, the fires, well, not fully out. There's still some smoke out there. They're contained, they're not growing. We found that about 13,000 acres or about 28% of the district was burned. And if you're asking yourself, you know, why we had 24,000 acres in the footprint, why didn't it all burn? Seth, could you go to the next slide? So this is our kind of, it says fire type, but it's a burn severity map. And I am colorblind, so that's why the colors are weird here. So that way I could see it because I can't see the low unburned areas on the other maps. So on that north block, you see that kind of yellowy center piece there. That's unburned. And so you can see that across our ownership inside the Beachy Creek fire, we had a pretty good portion that stood up to the fire. But we also have a good portion that was high severity. And what we've seen for our ownership on this fire, and I can't speak for the Forest Service or the BLM or private because I haven't done that kind of analysis, we saw about 25% of it be unburned, 25% in low severity, 25% in that moderate, and then another 25% in high severity. So it was a pretty classic mixed severity fire on our ownership. All right, next slide, Seth. So a little bit about the recreation impacts, you know, some of our most beloved, so this is looking west from the Natural Arch Trailhead. Again, you can see that's, I believe, Sardine Creek area, and it took the brunt of the fire right there. And that area wasn't so much mixed severity. That is pretty much high severity there. But really, I want to talk about the impacts to Shellburg Falls and High Lakes, and Shellburg in particular. It got hit pretty hard at Shellburg, and if you've been up there before, it doesn't look like it used to. We have very significant mortality, both on the trail and around the campground. The bridge burned out. You know, we're expecting Shellburg to be closed for many years. There's safety concerns. And then it was also a really important spot for the northern spotted owl. And so any restoration work that we do in there, we need to work with the biologists, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife to make sure that our restoration efforts aren't going to do anything to hinder the recovery of the owl in that area. And so we've got to be really thoughtful about what we do in Shellburg. So, and you know, part of Shellburg is on private property as well. And so we really ask you to respect the private landowner that's right there that is kind enough to allow us access to that beautiful site. And again, High Lakes area was heavily impacted. And then the moderate impacts and why, you know, it's important to remember that these are closed is I want to talk a little bit about the Monument Peak trail system. That wasn't so much hit by the fire as it was by the wind event. And so just because some of these areas were outside of the fire perimeter doesn't mean there isn't significant damage caused by the wind event. And that seems, it gets forgotten that we had those winds for so long. And so with the blowdown along the trail, and then if parts of the trail that were impacted by the fire as well, there's just an increase in chances for sedimentation. And so if the public's out there walking right now on it, that's increasing more sedimentation into the streams below, further degrading the habitat. And so Again, we're just kind of asking you to help us out there. And my last pitch to help us out, because I'm sure you're tired of me saying it, is, you know, when people do go in there, it diverts our resources from helping to protect the forest resources, and it's going to take longer for us to get it open to the public, the more the public uses it. And so we're trying to get it open as quickly as possible, and we'll do our best. All right, next slide, Seth. So reforesting the Santiam State Forest. We get asked this question a lot. The first one, why? You know, there's a natural process of reforestation. The forests have always reforested themselves after fire, and that's right. And, you know, we have 13,000 plus acres to reforest. That would be like 5 to 9 million seedlings that we would need. And that's never going to happen. We're not going to be able to get those trees, or we're not going to be able to plant in some of those areas for safety concerns or other things. So some of our forest will go through that natural process, and it should. It's important to have the natural process out on the landscape, and those shrubby early seral species are great for birds. We see deer and elk move into that habitat. But we also want to plant, because some of our mandates with the Oregon Department of Forestry is greatest permanent value. So there's an environmental, a social, and an economic impact there. And so we do want to make sure that we're planting some areas so that in 75 years, the counties that are up there and rely on some of these timber dollars have some harvests that they can do, both thinning and, you know, variable retention harvests. But we also want to help promote habitat. And so part of that is getting trees growing rapidly in areas we know where there are spotted owls and other things. So that way that habitat comes back online for the owl. But it's not just about owls. There's other things that enjoy the trees as well. So we want to get those there. And, you know, the social impacts is we want to make sure that there's a forest around our recreation sites, not for us, because it's not coming back in our lifetime, but for like our children and our children's children to walk through big trees again. And so it's going to be really important to get into those areas that we value for recreation and to plant. And that's also going to help with soil stability and that runoff that we're seeing. And so we are going to go in and do some planting. We're going to also do some aerial seeding, where we go into some of the really remote, steep areas and put seed out. And we know, you know, that's not always been effective, but it'll help us. And in that mix, it's not going to just be seedlings. We will be doing some forage mix and some wildflower mix as well along some roadsides and other areas to help promote forage and pollinator habitat. And then we are going to rely on natural regeneration. You saw the mixed severity, so that natural regen is going to help us put some trees back on the landscape, and it'll help keep the genetics and the families that were out there before the fire. And so we'll have a mix of that on our land. And then when, you know, that's the other question. We're lucky with the state, we're going to be operating pretty quickly here. We're going to do some aerial seeding on the Rocky Top and Natural Arch area in the next few weeks to really capture that early on. And then we've got about 300,000 trees to plant this winter in Santiam, so we'll start that in mid to late December. And then we have 1 million trees coming for 2022. Like I said, we need about 5 to 9 million, so we're not going to get everything that we want. So we are going to be cognizant of where we go to plant, but and do our best to make sure that we're not leaving a negative impact on the forest by our current operations. And so with that, Seth, I will give it to, and I guess one last comment here too, with the reforestation, is it's really important just on a kind of a climate change aspect as well, as we want to get trees out there that are growing fast and vigorously. And that's what our goal is. And so, you know, that's going to have a lasting impact for future generations. And so I will end that, Seth, and turn it back to you.
Thank you, Robbie. And I know I promised everybody a chance for Q&A, but I also promised that we would show some ideas for how you could help, because there have been lots of people reaching out saying, you know, can I go plant trees? Can I help clear trails, that sort of thing. And as you've heard multiple times from the different agencies, the best thing to do is stay off the land right now. But there is another alternative, and our nonprofit has decided that given the extra strains on each of the public land managers that are caused by COVID, we decided that we should establish a campaign to assist the agencies in the replanting effort. So we are starting a replanting fund. Every dollar you donate plants a tree. Donating is really easy. You can text on your phone, you can text replant to 41444, or you can point your smartphone camera at the QR code that's on the screen And I will put this back up after we have the Q&A time. But we're calling the program Replant Oregon, and we've set a goal of raising at least $1 million to be spread among the 3 agencies represented tonight, as well as the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department and the Parks Departments in the counties of Clackamas, Marion, Lane, and Jackson. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Megan Josie, who has been seeing all the questions that have been coming in, and let her give some questions to the panelists.
Okay, hello all. Thanks for staying till the end. There's been some great questions, hard to narrow it down. One that does keep coming back that I think might be an easy one to answer, potentially, is in Lynn's presentation, she mentioned, you know, before you head out, check where you go. Is there a specific place or one website? How would one like to answer that so a recreator could be prepared to go out? Somebody want to take that?
So Megan, I'll mention, I just put in the chat, right now, there's not one website. I think we would all love to get to that phase as we get more information. I put an example in there of the website for the Willamette National Forest, which on their site, they have the closures or what's available, say in the Holiday Farm or their part of Beachy. And I think each agency has one. For each national forest affected, the Umpqua, the Rogue River Siskiyou, the Mount Hood, they have a similar website. And hopefully we'll get to an integrated one. We're not there yet.
Great. Another question is, in a specific area affected by mixed severity fire, are there features of the land, et cetera, that seem to contribute to how severely an area burns? That question makes sense? Somebody field that one?
Yeah, it's hard to say. And I know that's a no answer, and I'm sorry, but it is. And these events, you know, what we saw on ODF ground is it burned up to the ridge lines on some, and then the wind was moving so fast that it hit the ridge top and it spotted embers 1 or 2 miles away. And on the other side of that ridge, it wasn't as affected. But that's just on our ownership. And it really, the wind was so vicious on those 3 days that it's going to take somebody way smarter than me with a fire background to really look at that and figure it out.
Yeah, I think as Robbie's pointing out, terrain makes a big difference, topography, but you're also dealing with the dynamics, not only of the wind that's there naturally, but also the winds that the fires themselves create. So you can get conditions that are caused by the fires of certain intensity, depending on how much fuel they're burning, where they can create their own winds. So slope can make a difference, fuels on the ground, yeah, lots and lots of different conditions can cause one area to burn severely and another to be lightly touched. So it's not always as easy as just predicting the wind was coming from the west, so it should have burned up the slope hotter than another area.
Okay, let's see, another question. Was there a difference in fire intensity between commercially managed forest and government managed forest?
I guess I haven't done analysis on federal or private. I've really, the month after the fire started, we were fighting the fires, and now we're working on the rehab on our land. So I can't speak to what happened on the federal or private landowners.
Okay. Yes. So Seth, maybe you can mention this again, that some people that joined late are asking about it being recorded and how they would get access to the full webinar, and then also the links that are being shared in the chat, if those can be shared.
Sure, we're going to, once the, it has been recorded, and once the recording is available, we'll post it out to orparksforever.org, our website, and we'll also send out a message to everybody who attended tonight so that you know that it's live, so you don't have to keep going back and looking for it. At the same time, since we're sending that out, we also should be able to send out the links that were shared in the chat box.
Okay. Want some more questions here? They're coming in. There's been some about how fires started. But Jim, I think you've been responding saying that a lot of those are still under investigation.
Yeah, I know. I don't know if they're there, but I speak with our fire investigators quite often, answering these questions for media that are constantly wanting to know the cause of this or that fire. And just like with any investigation, their job is to actually take in reports, eyewitness reports, other things that might be suspected to be the cause, but then they work for, to look at the forensics, to investigate the sites, and to actually make a determination of what actually can be said truly to have caused a fire. Some fires it's never known for sure what the cause was. In others, they might suspect early on a particular cause, but they're going to confirm that through their investigations. And that can actually take a long time, months or longer than a year to determine. And very often that's because in Oregon and other places, when you investigate a fire and you determine a cause, that can also establish responsibility for that fire. And they want to make sure that their investigation will stand up to scrutiny if in fact that will be challenged by someone saying, are you sure that what you're saying was the cause was my lawnmower or my vehicle? So they want to be absolutely sure that they've done a very thorough and diligent investigation. And that can be frustrating for people that say, well, my neighbor said they thought they saw this or that happen. And it can be a long time before that can be officially confirmed. So.
I'd just like to point out we're at the 8 o'clock hour now. We said we were going to stop at 8 o'clock, but we do have quite a number of questions still pending. So why don't we give it a couple more minutes, maybe 2 or 3 more questions, and then we'll be able to cut it off.
Okay. So some of the questions around replanting, they are, will the most severely burned area regenerate or accept planted trees? And if not, what level of burn will accept it?
Then do you want to go or do you want me to? So we've looked at our areas, even where it was severe, and we feel confident that we'll be able to plant in there. Our soils didn't get hot enough where they're hydrophobic and will actually repel water on this fire. In terms of natural regeneration, it really depends on distance from how far a tree is alive. So after a couple hundred feet, seed rain starts to fall off. So you're not going to get long distance natural regeneration. So we will go into some of our high severity fires and plant a mixture of species. We're not going to just be planting Douglas fir. We will be doing Douglas fir, noble fir, grand fir, western hemlock, western red cedar, and red alder. And there's been a couple other questions about that. And then the other kind of thing is we will be putting out native shrub and other species of seed. We won't be doing actual plantings, but we will be putting some of that seed out.
Great. So many good questions. I think, there's one that's talking about controlled burning, and maybe that would be a way to control or lessen these fires in the future. Maybe that got touched upon and I missed it, but is that something that controlled burning as a tool can be addressed?
Controlled burning, Oregon has forest collaboratives, which have been working in particularly east of the mountains in the pine forests, which are naturally adapted to periodic low intensity fires. And I know the Deschutes National Forest, Lynn, you're probably familiar with those folks. They've been doing a lot of community education, working with their local collaborative and local officials to try and gain more public understanding and acceptance of the need for those forests to burn in order to actually be healthy, for those forests to maintain resilience and reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfires. The Nature Conservancy is a big landowner that does try and use those natural processes of low intensity fires to help control invading tree species that wouldn't normally be found there, because they're like grand fir and Douglas fir can sometimes creep into forests where fire has been suppressed unnaturally and create a much denser canopy than that forest can actually support in dry years. And so fire is considered a tool. One of the issues, though, is that as population density increases, people have an adversity to having a large fire lit right next, their backyard. So it's possible to use that tool in some areas. In others, we've just changed the landscape ownerships and the development patterns such that it's harder to use that tool safely around, built structures and people. There's also the issue that even a controlled burn will generate some smoke. And last time I talked with Oregon Health Authority, they said, well, there's not really a level of smoke that they would encourage people to breathe. Question is, we know that when you have wildfires, as we've all experienced, huge amounts of wildfire at times of the year when you can't, where the winds are not going to disperse it. Controlled burning, at least as managed under the Oregon Department of Forestry, is designed to be timed for when the weather conditions will help disperse that away from populated areas as much as possible. And because you're generally burning smaller volume of downed woody debris rather than entire forest, usually the smoke volume is lower. The controlled burns, where feasible, definitely can, we believe, can reduce the risk of a catastrophic stand replacing kind of fire, particularly in forests that are naturally adapted to that kind of fire interval.
I think that's all the time we have today, but thank you all very much for attending, and to the presenters, thank you very much for a very insightful presentation. I know I've learned a lot. I hope other people attending have also enjoyed it, and I really appreciate that you gave up your evenings, part of your evening, to come in and learn this. I'd like to just remind you about the campaign and the way you can help. And so here's the fund again. Remind you that every dollar donated to this campaign will plant a tree. And if you would like to be able to help get our wonderful forests and parks replanted as soon as possible, please donate to the fund. In the meantime, again, thank you to all the presenters and all of you participants for joining us this evening. Hope you have a nice evening.
Seth, thank you. Good night. Appreciate your.
Aaron, thank you very much. I really appreciate all the extra effort you guys put into this. This was really as I said, a fascinating presentation, and really appreciated that.
Yeah, appreciate the opportunity to be involved. Thank you, and nice to meet you, Lynn and Aaron.
Yep, you too, Jim. Thank you. Thank you, Seth.
All righty. Take care.
Say, Seth,
Yeah.
are you and Megan hoping that we'll try to answer all of these questions at some point that were shared, or the ones that we are able to?
I hadn't really focused on that, but I think that's
Okay.
a nice idea if you're open to it. I mean, and Jim took on a bunch of the ones that came in beforehand.
Yeah, I think he covered a lot of the elements in many of these. and some are fairly big picture, but maybe if there's a way that you and Megan could at least save the Q&A, I can see whether or not there's some of them we could address.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
All righty, well, thanks. Good
Thank
to
you.
engage with you, and we'll connect another time.
Thanks for your help.
Thank
care.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.